Hello and welcome to Past, Present, Future Cast, the podcast that's also a tarot card reading. I'm your host, Maria Elena Pakoulis, and we're going to jump right into it this week with our card of the week for February 16th through the 22nd. So the card that I've pulled for us this week is the Five of Cups. If you're watching on the video version, you can see the card that I'm holding up. The Five of Cups shows a figure kind of facing away from the viewer of the card. They've got like a three-quarter, they're like three-quarters turned away from us. They're wearing a long black cape. Their head's down and they're looking at three cups knocked over in front of them. And you can see red spilled out of the cups onto the ground. Behind them, two cups remain standing. In the distance, we see a river, a bridge crossing the river, and we see some kind of building off into the distance. It's a very forlorn looking card. It looks a little sad. And when I first pulled this card, the first thought that came to mind, I had been thinking about this card earlier today. And I had been thinking about this card earlier today for kind of a funny reason. I was remembering that before the election that we just had in 2024, the presidential election, that Fox News had a tarot card reader on to pull a card. They were pulling a card specifically for that asshole, that guy. I don't like saying his name. I was thinking about that segment that Fox aired and that woman who had pulled the Five of Cups. I like I was saying, I believe they framed it as like we're pulling a card for him, for that person who was eventually elected. And she flipped it over and I remember she was like stunned for a second. And I think the host like prompts her of like, okay, like what does this mean? And she kind of chuckles and she goes, a sense of loss. And I was just thinking about it today because I was thinking about how the way that was maybe interpreted immediately in the moment, obviously, is not what happened, right? He didn't lose. And I'm not in the game ever of interpreting other readers' pulls. I don't think that's a good practice. One of my pet peeves is when people send me a picture of a reading and say, what do you think this means? Because it doesn't mean shit to me. What it means to you is the only thing that matters. But I was again thinking, it's interesting that she said a sense of loss, that her interpretation of the Five of Cups is a sense of loss. Because for me, yes, and that's not the first word that would come to mind. I guess if you're thinking about it in terms of a competition where there's a winner or a loser, maybe that's what you would go for. But for me, grief is the first kind of keyword that I give for the Five of Cups. But then pulling back from that a little bit, getting a little more neutral, because every card is neutral. The context in which the card is being received is what kind of determines the positive or negative qualities of what it's expressing. So my more neutral definition for the Five of Cups is emotional change, or like a change in the internal landscape, changes in felt sense, changes in connections, changes maybe in relationships. And from my perspective, the reason why the fives in the Tarot Minor Arcana, so the suits, when we say Five of Cups, Five of Swords, Five of Wands, Five of Pentacles, those four, the imagery of the fives is traditionally quite negative. It's traditionally quite stressful looking or scary looking. Fives are not often depicted as looking very fun. My reasoning for that is because change is often scary. Our little lizard brains, as humans, the deepest part of our brains, want things to stay the same because we know that we can survive that. We know that we have survived anything that we've experienced already. Change equals potential danger to some of those like deeper instinctual parts of ourselves. The fear of change is such a common fear. And speaking of that person who got elected and the people who support him, so much of their rhetoric and their platform is about going back to the past, going back to things that we've experienced before, and not having change, not wanting to progress. Like, his whole platform was this pushback from Obama's change. Like, that was the word that he campaigned on, right? So in thinking about what that card was kind of an omen for, it's just kind of interesting to think about how the people, the person, the party who is more resistant to change and who maybe when it comes to change have that more morose attitude about it, were the ones who prevailed, and then the rest of us were plunged into this really intense grief. I know, God, I felt it. The grief, the emotions, the stirring of feelings, the focus on, oh my God, what has been spilled and what blood might potentially be spilled, noting that it's red that's coming out of those cups. All of that was very heavy and overwhelming post-election. So just things that I'm thinking about, because I was contemplating the fact that that card came up as this like public omen on Fox News before the election. And then it was pulled again today. So what have we learned since then? What have we learned about change and about what cups have been knocked over and what cups are still standing? What cups are still standing? How can we find stability in that? What bridges can we build to cross over to the other side of maybe this raging river that feels like it's standing between us and maybe a better future? I just pulled out a book because I remembered a fantastic quote about the fives from this book titled Tarot Beyond the Basics by Anthony Lewis. I don't always recommend this book because it has a lot of gender essentialism in it, but I have gained a lot from this book, especially in terms of understanding the numbers and the numbers in the minor arcana. So Lewis writes here talking about the number 5. If we accept the Pythagorean notion that each additional digit adds a new dimension, and that a minimum of 4 points generates a 3-dimensional structure. Okay, so we're accepting the notion that, so if we have 1 point, that's 1 dimension. It's kind of like the 0th dimension. If we add a second point, now we can draw a line. Now we have like one linear little plane. If we add 3 points, now we have 2 dimensions. Now we have a 2-dimensional shape. If we add 4 points, so like they say, a minimum of 4 points generates a 3-dimensional structure. So a minimum of 4 points, the 3 points that form a triangle, and then 1 point on another dimension creates a solid structure. So a minimum of 4 points creates a 3-dimensional structure. Then the number 5, adding 1 more point, adds the notion of motion as a 4th dimension. In other words, 5 distinct points make possible the generation of 3-dimensional solids that can move in time. The 4th dimension is time, right? Motion, movement. Once we have movement, we have the possibility for change. Something has to be able to move in order to be able to change. Mathematics was originally a science of measurement, and the measurement of motion requires, we're going back to the quote, this is back in the quote, mathematics was originally a science of measurement, and the measurement of motion requires a concept of the passage of time. From the Pythagorean perspective, the number 4 is static, and 5 is the first number to make motion possible. With the introduction of motion comes the inevitable changes that take place over time. Thus, 5 fundamentally suggests change and instability as portrayed in the related tarot pips. Minor arcana cards are also called pips. Fun fact. Okay, putting the book away. So that gives us a little bit of theory, a little bit of numerology, a little bit of philosophy on why 5 and the 5s in the minor arcana are associated with change. Talking about the Five of Cups, specifically, cups is water. It's our emotions. It's our connections to other people, the way we like blend our energy fields through our relationships. So the changing of our emotions, the changing of our relationships, the changing of that kind of more internal landscape, it can be sad when some of our relationships change and adjust. It's sad when we lose a connection that we've had previously. But that's not the only possibility when we're talking about change. There's also generative change, creative change, positive change. That speaks a little bit more to the 6. Like that's what we're aiming for when we're moving from the 5 to the 6. We're wanting to create that generative, creative change, that expansive change. 6 is our expansion. What this could be advising for the week of the 16th to the 27th is let those emotions move. If you need to cry, cry it out. If you need to dance, get some physical movement to get those emotions flowing through you. Hey, maybe you went to the Sacred Fool workshop on the 16th, or maybe you're listening to this early on the 16th and you have time to go and register for the Sacred Fool workshop hosted by last week's guest, Chris Carlone. Getting that, we were talking about that a lot last week, about how movement can help us to like move the emotions and the feelings and energies through the body. So that's something that I would recommend. Getting in water. I just came from a bath. Honestly, I'm recording this immediately post bath. And then also remembering when there is change, movement, shifting, things of that sort. If you are feeling really unmoored by that, to take a look around and take note of what is still the same. In this image, all 5 cups are not spilled. It's only 3. There's 2 cups that are still left standing, but that figure, that person has their back to them. They're not really paying attention to them. They're really focused on the cups that have spilled. They're sad over the cups that are spilled. They are crying over spilt milk, and that's okay. Go cry over spilt milk. But taking a moment to identify and hold some gratitude or some love or hold space, like we were talking about all summer with Wicked, hold some space for what remains and what is still stable and standing in your life. That can help to kind of orient you amidst all the change. Okay, there's one other thing I want to talk about. As I started shuffling, I started thinking about some other signs that I've witnessed that I wanted to share a little bit. So something about being a tarot reader and someone who has studied and worked with the tarot for many, many years is at some point you stop just receiving signs and symbols and little nudges from your deck, and you can start receiving them elsewhere. You pay attention to the little taps, the little nudges, the little moments that are like, boop, a little message from the universe. So last weekend was the Super Bowl, and we all watched Kendrick Lamar put on an incredible and politically charged performance. A part that I want to uplift today is something that was not scheduled. It was not planned, as far as we know. And that is the protester, the person who was a dancer in the show who held up a Palestinian flag with the words Gaza and Sudan written on it. And he held it up, eventually was taken into custody, but was released, and as far as I know is not facing any charges. So his name is Zulkarnain Nantambu. I have not heard his name said out loud, so I do not know how I did in the pronunciation, but Zulkarnain Nantambu. And he, in an interview with Al Jazeera, had something really profound to say that I would really like to uplift as a message, so I'm going to repeat it to you here. So he said, "And we know, as a practicing Muslim, our Prophet Muhammad teaches us, if you see a wrongdoing or you're aware of a wrongdoing, you must stop it with your hands. And if you can't stop it with your hands, stop it with your tongue. Speak out against it. And if you can't stop it with your tongue, try to stop it with your heart," meaning pray about it. End quote. That's the end quote there. So he saw that he had an opportunity to take a stand against a wrongdoing that he saw. And I like that sequence of events. If you can't stop it with your hands, right now it's really difficult for any of us listening to this to stop the wrongdoings that are happening physically with our hands. There are some instances in which we can. Try to look out for those. If you can't stop it with your hands, stop it with your tongue. Speak out against it. If you can't stop it with your tongue, stop it with your heart. Pray on it. All of us, I'm willing to bet all of us are in some way able to speak out against the things that are happening right now. So again, I'm going to encourage you to do so. And I wanted to uplift those protesters' words. That was an interview with Al Jazeera where he said that, and you can go check that out. I saw it, like I said, on TikTok. And that, my friends, is some of what I wanted to say this week. Before we get into this week's interview, just a couple quick announcements. First, I will be reading tarot at Witchcrafted on February 22nd at the Glendale Civic Center. This is a really cool, large market featuring all kinds of witchy wares and services. There's going to be some other tarot readers, but I hope you come see me. This is your only opportunity to get a personal tarot reading with me for the time being. I'm just doing some little pop-up events here and there while I focus on getting this project up and running, and then I will open up my books again for private readings, which I love to do. You can find more information about Witchcrafted at witchcraftedmarket.com. And there's one last little note that I want to make before we go into the interview today, and this starts with a lore drop. So little lore drop about me, your host. I went to ASU for college, that's Arizona State University, and I majored in women and gender studies. I received my BA in women and gender studies. Now this degree is called gender and sexuality studies, which is a little more apt for what I was learning and studying, but I think on my degree it says women and gender studies. Anyway, that being said, I do want to point out and name that the first two guests on my podcast are men. That is only due to a technical issue. So absolutely no shade to either of these guys, either of these men. Their conversations or our conversations were interesting and valuable, and I was going to have them on anyway. Like we did the interviews. I had just planned a different order for how my first few interviews were going to release, but the one that I originally planned to have this week, the file got messed up and we lost the entire interview, so I had to switch some things around. So we do have two men as my first guests on the pod, and again, love to these guys, but as someone who was trained to view things through the lens of queer theory, I, as a listener, would be questioning this choice. And so I just wanted to explain why. It was not intentional, and it was not an unintentional, like I didn't notice. I really noticed, and I was actually kind of stressed out about the fact that the first two, these were gonna be the first two interviews. I just wanted it to be in a different order, but they're both really great interviews. If you listened to last week, I loved the interview that I did with Chris, and I think that you're gonna really enjoy the interview with Ian today. So I just wanted to give a little note about that. And for anyone who is decentering men in 2025 and would prefer to listen to interviews with women or non-binary people, trust that I have a massive lineup of very cool women and non-binary guests already on the calendar, already scheduled, already upcoming. But I hope you give this interview a listen because it is a good one. So here is my interview with Ian Von Cleve. All right, I am here with Ian Von Cleve. How are you doing today, Ian?
Hi, I'm doing great. Yeah, we just had the cranial sacral session and I feel incredible. That was amazing.
Awesome. I'm glad you're feeling good. Ian is a stuntman and a hypnotherapist in training, which is actually what led us to this interview today. So I ran into Ian at a sound bath with one of our wonderful past, present, future guests. I don't know if this episode will be coming out before or after Rose's episode, but we were both at Rose's New Year's sound bath. And Ian brought up that he has been doing some really cool hypnotherapy training, and I volunteered. I volunteered to be a subject, to be a guinea pig.
Yes,
so
thank you.
you're welcome. So we did that last week, and then today we're coming together. After that experience, I said, I really need to talk to you more about this. So we did that experience last week. We're going to talk more about that. And then today we got together to do a little my part of the trade. We did a craniosacral therapy session for Ian, and now we're doing this interview. How are you feeling after that session that we just did?
I feel incredible, pretty energized. I've never experienced that before, so it was pretty wild. I felt just all my energy centers opening up. My body was twitching, and I can't say enough good things about it. You really have a gift with this.
Thank you.
Your hands were so hot the entire time. Through my sweater, I could feel the heat from your hands. Really, wow. Thank you. That was incredible.
You are welcome. And thank you, because the session that we did, I mean, I think that's a lot of even what came up in the session of working with my hands and doing that kind of energy work. So it was really cool. I haven't been doing a lot of energy work recently, so it was awesome to be able to get back into that practice and reaffirm to myself that that is something that I like to do. But we're here today to talk about your work and what you've been interested in lately. So we've got our cards spread out in front of us here, our past, present, and future tarot readings. So starting with the present, Ian, can you tell me a little bit about this coursework that you've been doing and kind of what drew you to that? What is it in general? How would you describe it? Let's start there.
So I am getting my certificate for quantum healing hypnosis therapy, and it is a hypnosis style developed by Dolores Cannon, and it is also can be referred to as past life hypnosis. I really became interested in this a few years ago. I was familiar with her work and seen some videos on YouTube, and then I had finally listened to a book, and I just became very fascinated with it because the books are basically transcripts of sessions with clients and just the experiences that they have, recalling past lives, and not only past lives, but in between lives, and messages from their higher selves or ETs, or just the wildest things you could imagine would happen in these sessions. And I just became so fascinated with it, and I probably listened to about 10 books in a row, just audiobooks. And finally, at some point, I looked into the training and decided I would, give it a shot. My interest was definitely there. And I had a session done for myself a few years ago, and it was pretty remarkable too.
So I really just picked up on the phrase "in between lives." What does that mean?
So sometimes people will have an experience where they're not in a body. They'll regress to a time between lives or before they incarnate into a life, and the soul has information that it can give you in that area, or even like afterlife, after someone has gone through the death process. They're on the other side, and you can talk to the soul at that point too.
I think I remember a little bit of that from our session, where both of the lives that we kind of went to, we ended up on the day of the death, and then there was, I don't know if we really got into that, but I do remember you at least kind of prompting of like, okay, are you on the other side now? Mm-hmm. What kind of information? So, okay, that's making more sense to me.
Yeah, so the death is very important from previous lives because a lot of trauma can be held in death. Sometimes they're very traumatic experiences that the soul will carry forward. So it seems like every life kind of has some very key moments that define the life, and so those will come out, and you can really sum up a life pretty quickly by these key moments. And one of them is obviously death. How did the person die? What was that experience like? Was it traumatic? Are they holding on to any trauma from that death that they need to let go of? And are they carrying any of that forward with them? So it is important to go through that, through the death of the lives, not to feel the pain. We can have the subject or the client remove themselves as an observer, so they're not re-experiencing that process, especially if it was a very painful and traumatic death. You don't want them to re-experience that, but they can observe it and they can get some new understandings on it and why that happened, and what they need to release and let go of. Because it's amazing how those things can be affecting you in your current life, and we just have absolutely no idea.
Yeah, that kind of seems to be why, from my limited outside understanding, I've read like one book on past life hypnosis and regressions, but it seems like that's kind of part of the point, is to kind of help you identify what traumas, what wounds, what pains you've brought into this life with you, and help you release and work through them. Would you say that's accurate?
Yes, I think it's karma, and karma really is what we were holding attachment to. And so those things that we were unable to let go of, we have to resolve those things.
Yeah.
I can speak from personal experience with when I had a past life regression. So in this life, I work as a stuntman. I've done it for almost 20 years now. And I never really imagined this kind of work. I just kind of came into it. And when I had this, and also I grew up with scoliosis, and I've had some issues with my structure in my body. And it's also kind of been an obstacle for me, especially in physical work. And so it's been a frustration of mine where I've been like, oh man, I think I could be so much better if I didn't have these limitations in my body. And so that was kind of a question that I had going into the session of like, where did this come from? Why do I have this? And I went into this life, and it was before technology, before cars, and it was in like Arabia somewhere on the beach. And I was this extremely fit young man. I would deep sea dive and collect pearls, and I could swim for miles. And then like the story slowly unfolds like a dream. And I saw that I was a circus performer, particularly with animals. I had a trained falcon that I would use for tourists to impress tourists and earn money.
Very impressive.
Badass. And then I also had an elephant, and I would do tricks on this elephant, and just these amazing circus acts. And then I saw one day and this was a defining moment in the life. I was on a horse doing tricks, and the horse fell, and it crushed my hip and my leg, and I was disabled for life. And the grief that came up from this moment, like I saw it coming, and I just like so much grief came out of me that you're like, okay, this can't just be my imagination, because it's in my core. My whole body was just weeping, and it completely changed my life. And I saw that I was an old man then after this, and I still had a limp, and I had taken a job as like a janitor on a ship because it was the only way I could go out to sea at that time. And I still had a picture. It was a drawing of me, like an old advertisement of the circus with me and the elephant, and it was like my glory days.
Wow.
And so here I am in my life now, and I'm a stuntman, so it's very similar to these like daredevil acts in a performance, live performances. But what I carried forward with me was this injury. Like my leg, I've got this pronated ankle that has always bothered me, and this hip and shoulder, and I worked through them. But it was like, why do I have this? And it was like, oh wow, I've carried this trauma from that life where I was disabled. And I also, interestingly enough, had this extreme fear of having a serious accident. Even though I continued with this work, at times it was like irrational, where I was just so afraid that I would have a disabilitating accident. And like, wow, okay, maybe I carried this forward, and this was some unresolved karma that I need to resolve now, or that I'm resolving and looking at now.
Do you feel like going through that experience, seeing yourself in this past life, helped you to let go of some of that fear? Or is it still present and maybe it's just more of an understanding now?
I feel like I have a greater understanding, though I couldn't really tell you why. I think that's something I'm still uncovering, but there's so many pieces that kind of connected together that just made a lot more sense on some kind of visceral level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. That's incredible. I love, like, especially that connection between this past life that you experienced in hypnosis and meditation, and then that work that you're doing. I am so excited to talk about your stuntman work in a moment, but let's flip over this card that is representative of your present work and see what we're working with. We have the Four of Wands coming up, which I gotta say is not anything that I really expected for this story that you've been kind of weaving and telling. I'm thinking we're talking about hypnosis. It's gonna be like a cups card, or we're talking about the mind. It's gonna be wands, but we've got fire here with the mind. It's gonna be swords. I misspoke. But with fire here and the wands, and some of that I think is coming out in this like passion. Like, I'm hearing that you devoured books on this topic. Like, once this topic kind of came into your frame of reference, you immediately were like, it like lit up by it, to kind of dive into study and research. And that's the kind of passion that I am referring to or describing when I'm talking to tarot clients about the suit of wands. It is that like all-consuming passion where you're like diving into, it's the new special interest. It's like, I'm so excited to learn more and more about this. Does that feel relevant to kind of your experience of getting into this work?
Yes, I would say so. There's something just so fascinating about it. And then during the sessions, like the session that we had, it's just a really remarkable experience. The things that people say and that come out of them, you really do feel like you are tapped into a higher source or their higher self, and it doesn't take years of training and meditation. It's something that you can just do with an ordinary person and get to that level. So it's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, that experience was really wild. I am truthfully not someone who does a lot of meditation. I try, but I struggle with I'm not a visual person. So I remember even the first question you ask as you're kind of going under is like, oh, can you see, what was it, like a red ball or something, or like a red apple, something like that. And I'm like, no, I can't see that. I'm not a visual kind of person. But yeah, just with how long was the course that you have taken?
I think it took me a couple months to go through all the material, and now I'm currently working on getting 25 sessions under my belt to get the certificate before I can move on to the second level.
That's really quite amazing to me, because I was so immediately like, this guy is doing this very well. I knew you didn't have a ton of experience in it. I knew you were practicing and learning, but it really, yeah, with very little time but passion and excitement to dive into that. Because I'm sure, was it self-paced?
Yeah,
Yeah.
self-paced.
And so you've got to have like some passion to get into that. So both the suit of wands here describing that passion, and then the number 4. This is the 4 of wands. So the number 4 being like this kind of very structured number. The table that's in front of us right here has 4 legs, 4 sides. It's this like foundational structural number. So having the passion and excitement to build a strong foundation in this work, to really make sure you're absorbing that content, you're putting the time in to get through it, is, I think, definitely being reflected in this card. And then another thing that I'm thinking about with this card in front of us, I'll describe it for the audio listeners, and there will be images posted wherever I end up posting images, probably on Instagram. In this card here, we have, first of all, an orange sky, an orange background. In the background, we see kind of like a castle, just like symbolic of some kind of residential area or city area where people live. And then we see some figures way in the background, some people way in the background. And then in kind of like the middle ground, there's 2 figures, and they're holding what seem to be like bouquets or like groups of flowers, maybe fruit. So 2 figures, and they're walking towards 4 wands that have been stuck in the ground that have kind of like maybe a garland, we could describe it, between them. It's almost like a huppah for like a Jewish wedding ceremony. It's kind of this structure that is actually meant to invoke this image of maybe marriage or union, some kind of like celebration, potentially these 2 people forming a union here. And so that's making me think about how this structure that you were studying, this kind of formalized structure for how to give this experience that you are passionate about with the suit of wands, really does kind of bring you and another person together in a very intimate setting. That is really quite a union of like minds and energies as you're going through that. Like, you do such a good job of setting the space and making the person that you're working with feel like very safe, but it's like a deeply intimate experience to have you, Ian, kind of like walking someone through maybe some of the most traumatic moments of their past lives.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Very intimate. Yeah.
Yes, agreed. It is very intimate. And I think it does require a level of trust too with the client. Some people, it's typical for some people for their first time, they are a little reserved, or they want to hold back, or they don't know what to expect. They don't want to reveal too much. They don't know who this person is. But I do find that usually throughout the session, people will begin to relax a little bit more, and maybe can really get deep by the second half, or a second session. Sometimes people need to do the first one. They see, okay, I understand how that works now, and they had some interesting experiences too. And then by the second time, they're willing to let go.
That makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Wow. Here's one more question I want to ask before we start moving on to your past experiences. What has surprised you the most, either from moving through the coursework or in these practice sessions that you've done so far?
I think the most amazing thing about this technique is that people sometimes will have spontaneous healings. And I've experienced it a few times, and I've also seen in the coursework and some of the live sessions that they recorded some pretty remarkable healings that take place. And we were discussing earlier, it's like the inner physician, inner physician that everybody has.
Craniosacral term. Shout out to Dr. John Upledger.
Right. So the inner physician there's a chance at the end where we speak to the subconscious mind, and their inner physician will come out, and they can either diagnose what's going on with the body or what's happening, and sometimes they will heal it. And so, for example, I was doing this session, And we're asking the subconscious why they brought forth these lifetimes for us to see. And then out of the blue, the client says, we're working on her neck. And it's like, oh, okay, what do you mean you're working on her neck? And they said, we're working on her neck and it will be healed by the end of this session. And so I didn't even know she had issues going on with her neck. And when she woke up, her neck felt great. And she said she had so much tension and pain in there for a while. And she couldn't believe how good it felt. And also the subconscious diagnosed why the pain was there and what she needed to do to keep it from coming back. And so the inner physician comes through and
yeah. Yeah, and I can speak to that too, because I know there was a moment in our session where we were working on releasing some pain in the right side of my neck and along my right shoulder blade, and it's something that it has felt a lot better since that session.
wow.
I mean, I do carry a lot in my neck and shoulders, and especially with my work as a massage therapist. But yeah, I definitely have noticed a difference, because there's always been this like aching, like it felt like this like crazy knot that was just always there, tugging, pulling. And I'm like, yeah, I have like my other regular shoulder stuff, but that actually feels better, that specific spot.
Still to today.
Yeah,
cool.
Definitely.
So another person with a neck issue that
go.
was resolved in the
Yes.
session.
Amazing. Okay, so we've got this Four of Wands here with this like passion project. And this, I might add, another layer. When we're talking about wands, I'm often talking about like it's the work you're doing in the world that's coming from a passion place, and it's not your career. So when I'm doing readings, I'm often distinguishing between, okay, here's information on your career and like the work that you do that makes you money. And then here's information on the work you're doing in this world that is kind of maybe intermingled with what makes you money, but is much more expansive than that. Like it's if you're into astrology, when we talk about the midheaven, the midheaven speaks to your career, but it speaks to like the work, capital W, that you're doing in this world. And so that also feels like you're kind of setting a foundation and setting a structure to kind of continue this work, and to it feels like this is kind of part of your purpose. We were talking a little bit earlier when we finished the cranio session. You were like, oh my gosh, energy healing, energy work, like that's definitely part of your purpose. And one of the things that struck me in our hypnosis session was that you just seem so well suited to be doing this hypnosis work, that maybe some of this is you setting the structure for that kind of purposeful work in your life. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, yes.
Yeah, and we'll get to that more in the future card. So let's jump to the past now. Let's talk about, tell me about what we've mentioned, that you're a stuntman. Is that primarily the work that you've done? We're just talking about work, the career work that you've done in your life prior to this point, and I guess including this point.
Yeah, including, yes, in my early 20s.
How old are you now? I'm just curious.
I'm turning 40.
Oh my gosh. Congrats.
In about 2 months.
Oh,
yeah.
Cool.
So,
it's a big one.
Uh-huh. And so, in my early 20s, I was kind of acting. I was an actor. I've always been interested in the arts. So music and acting and writing. And I was acting, and I got work as a stuntman. And, I had two requirements for my work at that time. And one was, whatever my day job was, I wanted it to be something that was furthering me in my career, my interest. Because whatever you're doing 40 hours a week is what you're getting experience at, the most experience at. So I wanted it to be an entertainment, and I wanted it to further that development in me. And then the other thing that I wanted was to travel. I wanted to travel the world. And so this opportunity came up for me to go and work in a live stunt show in China. From there, I was able to work from contract to contract and lived all over the world and got that global perspective. And so now I have shifted where I write and I direct for this company. We produce shows primarily in China. We're producing shows there. And so that's been my work for the past 15, almost 20 years.
So how does one walk me through a little bit? How does one go from, because in my mind, I know nothing about the entertainment industry and the entertainment business. That is so far removed from my world. I'm fascinated by it. I respect it. I think it's really cool. But what is the how does one go from kind of working in acting to stunt work in China? That feels like a big jump in my mind.
Yeah, it is. It is kind of a big jump. So my first stunt job was at Old Tucson Studios in Tucson, Arizona.
Shout out.
And so I was hired and as an actor, and also there was a physical audition, and I suppose they saw they could train me. And so that's where I got my initial training as a stuntman. And from there, an opportunity opened up to go do a show in China, and I took it.
Oh.
And so those are the doors that kind of opened for me. And I do feel like part of my purpose too in this life was to really get that global experience. And so I think that opportunity I think a couple reasons, or more than a couple, but if my stunt work feels very karmic considering that life we just talked about. I think there's unresolved issues and fear I needed to face, and also this side of me that really is kind of maybe a daredevil. And then also I do feel like part of my purpose was to have a global perspective and have that experience from living all over the world. So
that's really interesting.
Yeah.
So they saw you and thought, okay, this guy maybe has some promise for like jumping off of stuff. What does stunt work usually entail? I imagine it's different job to job. What does your stunt work typically kind of looked like?
So I would say there's some typical skills that most stuntmen are expected to know or eventually learn, and that's like jumping or falling off of a building or heights, stage combat, being able to fall, take hits, shot reactions, fire burns, drifting cars, rappel work, wire work, some of these things. And I feel like for me, it was, you learn a skill. Every contract, you kind of learn a new skill, and that leads to the next job, and you learn something else. And so the people you work with, everybody, loves to share what they know. And so in this industry, you really do learn a lot from the people you work with, and just always keep learning. And that's how you build a career.
Wow, that's really fascinating. So your stunt work has taken you, how many times have you gone to work in China?
Ooh, I don't know. I've been there at least 10 times, maybe over 10 times, yeah.
Wow. Okay. So yeah, definitely getting that global perspective. Are there other places that you've traveled to?
Yes. So I lived in Germany for a couple years. I lived in the Dominican Republic. I spent a season in Dubai. I worked briefly in India and Tunisia, and I believe that's it. Yeah.
Is there a larger demand for these kind of stunt shows in other countries than there is in the US, or have you just been drawn to other countries because of that desire to travel?
For both reasons. I've also worked in the US, but I do feel like, especially in China, there is a big demand for these live shows, and where maybe in the US it was more the 90s and 2000s when that was really popular. But
Evel
it's very
Knievel
expensive. Yeah, it's very expensive to put on those performances. And I think the theme parks like Six Flags and a lot of those places have just scaled back, and audiences are less interested. There's still the big shows in like Universal Studios and Disneyland, but it's less common, where it's really become popular overseas and in Asia particularly.
Interesting. Okay. Well, let's take a look at this card here that's representing your past. So here we have the Seven of Pentacles coming up, which is interesting. So when you got into the entertainment industry, when you started, you said Old Tucson was kind of the first place you got into. I imagine was it on your radar to get into any kind of stunt work? Was this ever something that you considered for yourself?
No, never.
What
I couldn't
was your-
have even imagined it.
what was, you as, let's see, you said this was like 15 years ago, so you're in your 20s, your early 20s maybe. What was your vision of what your dream job or your most likely career path was going to look like?
So at that time, I was writing a lot of music. I'd been in some bands. I think that was my big dream. Was a career as a musician or a rock star or something like that,
Okay.
singer-songwriter. I also write and studied screenwriting and those kinds of things. So, and did film work. So it was very much in the industry.
Yeah.
But on a different side of it. I couldn't have ever imagined doing stunt work. The thought never even crossed my mind. I didn't even know that was a job you could do. Like, I knew there was Jackie Chan, but it just seemed like it took a certain special kind of person to do something like that.
Yeah, you had to be some kind of like prodigy. Prodigy is the word. I was like, we're not progeny. Prodigy. Jackie Chan, Evel Knievel keeps coming to mind. So were you maybe thinking that you were going to go like the LA route? Were you trying to go to Hollywood? Or was that any part of your plan? Your hopes and dreams?
It was potential. It was potential for me to go that route. I hadn't quite figured it out. And I think once this door kind of opened for me, I did really like the physical aspect of it and the performance aspect of it, because I had always been pretty active and into sports. And so it just seemed right at the time. I was like, I like this.
Yeah, okay. So it was like you kind of saw what was sort of being presented as some opportunities, things that you'd never even really considered before, and you were in a mindset or open to pivoting, open to taking that pivot and going, okay, well, I'm going to follow this path now. Let's see where that leads.
I don't think I ever imagined it leading me to where I am now. I kind of saw it as, oh, well, maybe I'll try that for a year or two and then get back to my original plan. And then, so I took this like 90-degree turn in life, and then that path just unfolded.
Yeah. Cut to 15 years later,
Right.
10 trips to China, India, all of that. And now you're kind of, would you say directing or writing scripting these shows? We'll get there. We'll get there in a second. But let's talk about this card, because what you're saying really lines up with how I typically define this card. We have the Seven of Pentacles in front of us. And again, for those audio listeners, I'll describe it. We've got this green background in the sky. There's a figure, we could maybe assume a man, standing here, and he's leaning on, maybe I like to think of it as like a garden hoe. He's leaning on some kind of big staff, probably gardening equipment, because he's looking at this big plant that's in front of him that has 7 pentacles growing on it. And he's looking at it with this face. He's a little bit morose. Oftentimes this card is associated with like disappointment, but that's only one aspect of it. A lot of times when I'm describing this card, the story that I tell is that, this farmer, this person who's growing this crop, what is starting to grow here, the fruits that are starting to be produced or that he's starting to see are coming forth are not what he was expecting to have. It was like there's this, maybe it's a slight disappointment of like, oh shoot, like this is not actually going how I had planned it to go. And the lesson, the wisdom of this card, or the invitation of this card, is to pivot, to get really clear, really honest about what is materially, what is in front of you, what's actually in front of you. We're talking about pentacles, so we're talking about career, we're talking about resources, we're talking about the material world, reality, what is really here in front of you, getting really clear on that, and then allowing yourself, rather than sitting in this like morose disappointment that this figure is showing on the card, it's important to allow yourself to respond and react to what is and kind of follow that new path. So as you're talking about this, I'm hearing that, okay, these possibilities that you had never really considered before, you didn't know that you could be cultivating a career in stunt work, but the opportunity arose. Okay, maybe the opportunity is here in stunt work. It's not in screenwriting at the moment, which is what I thought I was cultivating, what you thought you were growing. Let's pivot and follow this path now. Like you said, that 90-degree turn and following that, and now you've just been on that path. And looking at the progression of the past to the present, okay, some career changes, not quite what you anticipated when you were in your 20s, but it's brought you down this path, and it's brought you to this point where now you're really able to explore your passions, to travel the world, to do these things that get you really like excited. And now you found this connection between this current interest with the quantum healing hypnosis therapy and the stunt work with that past life that you discovered. There's a really interesting thread that's kind of like woven here.
Yeah, it is very interesting, because I think, there's always been a part of me too that was like, oh man, maybe I should have focused more on my music or my writing. But also I think in entertainment, I'm very lucky to have had steady, consistent work that supported me in this industry. And it's not that I've given up on my music and my writing. I still do that. Mm-hmm. So who knows what would have happened if I had tried to stick with that route too. And I think too, understanding that past life, it does seem to me that I feel like there really was a sense of destiny for me to do this type of work here. So yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah, and there's often like with this card, with the Seven of Pentacles, you mentioned like, okay, well, who knows what could have happened if you'd try to shoehorn, if you would try to force what your original plans were, what kind of that like early dream was, if you'd try to force that to be the career, yeah, who knows what would have happened. There's another depiction of this card of the Seven of Pentacles, which is really what kind of taught me a lot about what this card means. And it comes from the Fifth Spirit Tarot deck, which I actually have next to me here. And it shows, this deck is by Charlie Claire Burgess. They go by the Word Witch on Instagram. And this deck shows a trellis with a plant growing on it, and there's a little sign stuck in the plant and it says peas, but what's growing on the plant in the image is these little pumpkins are starting to grow. And if you keep the pumpkins growing on the trellis, if you try to force this plant to act like the peas you thought you were growing, that's going to actually harm the plant. It's going to harm and prevent you from having like the fullest outcome of your effort, because pumpkins can't grow well on a trellis. They're going to get too heavy and they're going to fall off. They don't grow the same way. They don't need the same care and attention as a pea plant does. So that kind of, if you don't accept the reality of what's in front of you, the opportunities that are in front of you, and you try to shoehorn, you try to force a career in music when other opportunities are actually coming up and presenting themselves, maybe you're doing yourself a disservice at the end of the day.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Amazing. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about kind of, you have a trip to China coming up quite soon. Your work has shifted a little bit from what you've told me, less on the stunt work, being the stunt man, and now you're doing a little bit more of kind of more creative aspect around that. How would you describe it?
Directing and coordinating.
Cool.
So now I am more on the production side of creating the shows and let the 20-year-olds come in and perform.
I was going to say, I imagine that's helpful as you're pushing 40.
Right, yeah. So I still love doing the physical work, but there's more longevity for me on moving into the other side.
You'll demonstrate and then they can take it from there. Amazing. Okay, so I also, I see that reflected in that 4 of Wands that we were talking about, of being more on that structural aspect of the very physical, almost aggressive. Like there is this like aggressive quality to stunt work. Like and by aggressive, that's a word that has a negative connotation, but I'm thinking of it more neutrally in terms of just like the things that Mars rules over, fire, like real intense physical activity, like high impact stuff. You said like stage fighting, all of that. So now there's more of this sense of you being the person giving that structure and choreographing that and directing that. All of that's really like 4 energy, where you're kind of giving structure to that raw, maybe like passion or athleticism of the performers there.
Yes, and I get to bring in my skill set as a storyteller and a writer, and so now I'm applying all those skills as well, but
That's cool.
in this niche, like in this area.
Okay, so next up, you need to start also creating the music that this is being set to.
Yeah, well, so I do actually arrange the soundtrack, and so I find the music. No way. I find the music and score the shows.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
so
really
it's very
creative.
much like producing a movie. It's live.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a live action movie.
That's wild. Okay, so where are you hoping to go with this? Both the stunt work and, well, first of all, I guess we kind of weave that connection between the stunt work and the quantum healing hypnosis therapy, the past life regression hypnotherapy, because of that like karmic connection that you have with it. Do you plan on continuing? It sounds like you want to get that level 1 certification. How many levels are there with Dolores Cannon's work? Do you know?
I believe there are 3 levels. Yeah, I think right now I'm just taking it step by step. And I imagine once I get my level 1 certificate that I will be inspired and be inclined to get the level 2 and go from there. I feel like this satisfies another side to me that maybe isn't satisfied in my career work, like you were saying before too. It's like we have multiple versions of work in our life, and career is just one aspect of that work that we do.
Yeah, it's interesting because I met you and I knew you first and foremost as someone who is quite spiritual. I met you at some spiritual events. I kind of like saw you in that framework. We were doing some like mini craniosacral sessions. So it was really interesting to learn that actually so much of your life has been dedicated to this like very unique form of entertainment. So moving forward, well, I guess one of my questions is, are you considering, as you continue practicing some of this hypnosis work, are you considering doing any of that professionally?
I think, I mean, it's an option. It's a possibility. At the moment, I just see it as something that can help people, and maybe I'm not looking at it as a source of income, but rather as something I can offer to people. And also, I find it very interesting too. So I've always felt this strong pull toward the esoteric world. And I grew up with my mother who was an astrologer. And so it's been a familiar part of my upbringing. And so I think that it's also maybe a skill that I can bring to the community. So maybe that's what attracted me to it.
Yeah. One step at a time. I don't mean to get ahead of your initial practice. Moving forward with this last card, this last section that I want to discuss here of the future, let's like dream a little bit. Like let's future vision a little bit. What are you imagining is coming down the line for you? You're heading to China. And then what?
So I'm pretty happy with the way I guess you could say my traditional work, the stunt work, and all of that is developing.
I don't think anyone would call that traditional.
Yeah, for me. Right, this has been for my career.
Yeah.
And how it's developing. I'm pretty happy with that. And then I think for the past few years, I've really felt this strong calling to get back to bring my spiritual work more to the foreground, where I've never completely lost it, but it's been more on the back burner for a lot of my life. I think especially as I've been more focused on the material world, and definitely within the past few years, I've just felt this strong calling that I have more work to do in this world and pulling that forward.
Let's see what the cards are maybe inviting you into in the future. Well, here we have the Queen of Pentacles coming up. So I think there is definitely some kind of like sinking into or combining of the material and the spiritual here. With all of the queens, I associate with the element of water. All of the queens are connected to water inherently, and water, like I was saying earlier, I thought water was going to come up with this present card with the kind of work that you're doing with like the unconscious, because water is so deeply connected to our soul, to our spirit, to the collective unconscious. But then with the combination with pentacles, that's the material. That's where we're really rooted and grounded. So I do kind of see this progression here of like bringing in more of that spiritual practice and connecting it in with the physical work, the physical reality, and almost the Queen of Pentacles. All of the queens are almost like this high priestess figure. And so you are kind of stepping into some of that priestess role, which can be of people of any gender can hold that, of course. Stepping into this priestess role as you're really like helping guide folks to experience and understand some of the material realities that their soul has experienced before this material experience. Are you seeing the same connections that I'm seeing with this card, or how I'm describing that?
Yeah, I'm not really sure how to interpret this card.
Yeah.
You're the master here.
So I'm thinking about connecting the spiritual world with the physical world, because queens being the spiritual, pentacles being the material, water and earth. So you kind of being this, maybe stepping more into a role of guiding, like when we're doing this past life work, we're examining the physical realities that our soul has previous experience in. Is that fair? Is that a fair like description of that?
Yeah, I think so.
Because when we did our session, one of the things that we talked about afterwards was how the two lives that came up, there was one, and I will admit here that I was kind of my consciousness that was still present as we were going through this session was a little embarrassed to admit that the past life that I was talking about was a well-to-do woman. She was clearly quite wealthy, came from a wealthy family, and there was a little bit of me that was like, I don't want to say that. But then that life's material experience was very wealthy, very well resourced, and then there was a different life that we explored that was totally the opposite of that, of someone living in a very small village, no like plumbing, just like a shack and some barren farmland. So as we're exploring these past lives, it's kind of getting a sense of what was the material reality that our soul has previously experienced. And so you're kind of helping guide people to discover that in a very spiritual way.
Yeah, agreed. I think, yeah, the queen aspect, I guess the emotional aspect, we're pulling something that is a little more metaphysical and grounding it into the material world, or into the material experience. And I think that a lot of this understanding can just help people be a more whole or rounded person in their material lives too.
Yeah, there is this using connection to spirit, connection to our highest self, our unconscious, whatever you want to call, or subconscious, to then also almost make changes to our current like material reality. Like we were talking about the spontaneous healing and just like how exploring these non-physical realms, these spiritual realms, or previously physical realms can help to kind of like bring healing and change into this life.
Yeah, I feel that the world as a whole is kind of going through this shift, and it's a lot more acceptable to be interested in these kinds of things, to allow them to, with quantum physics and all of these discoveries and things that are coming out, that this side of humanity is kind of opening more than it has in our recent past. And I think that it is important for development of everybody, not just on an individual level, but also as a collective development.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think we'll end on that note, because that is such an important such an important point, that there is quite a bit of awakening and opening to these non-physical, non-material concepts and phenomena that are very real. So I applaud you and respect you for diving into some of that work and helping to bring that to our community here. Thank you so much, not just for talking with me today, but for that session that we did last week. It was truly incredible.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your cranial sacral session. That was amazing. And also this interview with the tarot cards, this was great too. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, Ian, where can people find you if they're curious about your work? Maybe they want to jump into a practice session, or if you're going to be eventually offering non-practice sessions in quantum healing hypnosis therapy.
Well, you can find me on Facebook or Instagram under Ian Van Cleve. Also, I have a website, ianvancleve.com. And yes, I'd be very interested in volunteers, if I'm still taking volunteers for past life hypnosis or anything else. People can find me and feel free to reach out.
Yeah, if you want to hire him to direct, choreograph, sound design your stunt performances, I think he might be available for that as well. All right, thank you so much for talking to me today, Ian. This has been wonderful, and we will speak soon, I'm sure.